Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the female reproductive system. We're actually talking about this in my science class, my anatomy class, so it's kind of cool that I could do my speech over this because I have some background knowledge, and then it was just like putting pieces together, finding sources to back up the information that I kind of already know, and being a woman, I kind of already know some of that stuff anyway. So the female reproductive system is arguably the most important system in the body, and I feel this way because, you may think it's like the nervous system because your brain and your nerves control everything you do in your body, or like your muscular system because, it controls your movements, but without the female reproductive system, those wouldn't be there in the first place. In the 9 to 10 months that the 11 systems develop, it's just so incredible that like a female body can just hold this clump of cells and make it into something like more. It's just so weird to me. I can't figure it out. It's weird. So I have some notes over the organs of the system, like the internal organs. I left out the external organs because they're not as important for this side of things, but of course they are important. These are from my teacher's notes, Miss Madlock. These are her original notes. The main function of the female reproductive system is to produce and maintain the egg cells that will eventually, potentially, become a fetus and delivered to the outside. And that system does all of it, including the male reproductive system has one little part in it, of course. The first organ that I have on here is the ovaries, and this is where the primordial follicles, I'm pretty sure I said that right, maybe. These are where those form. It's the pre-egg cells, and there are several million during fetal development, so after about 8 weeks, you start to, like in your mom's stomach, you start to develop these primordial follicles, and then there are several million. At birth, you have 1 million. There's 400,000 when you start puberty, and then 400 to 500 are released during ovulation, and then less than 10 will form a new individual. Next is the ovum. It's an egg. It's just the egg. It has a nucleus and it has cytoplasm, and then when the sperm fertilizes it, it penetrates the cell membrane and then wraps itself around, and then the cell membrane changes so that other sperm cells don't fertilize it or can't fertilize it. My next organ is the fallopian tubes. This is what moves the egg to the uterus. This happens during menstruation when one single egg comes out and moves down through the uterus and then is bled out with the rest of the blood. But when the egg and the sperm get together, the fallopian tubes move it down through the to the uterus, where the egg will develop. The uterus is next. This is where it receives the embryo or the zygote and then becomes an embryo, and it develops here. I'm pretty sure we all know that. And then the vagina is the opening for the offspring during birth. No need to explain that. Next, these are still notes from my teacher's notes, the hormones that come into play and how they interact. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are glands in your brain, and those are really, really important in secreting luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone, which control female sex cell maturation, which is basically like your eggs become like they're able to be fertilized, but when before puberty, that can't really happen. And then the follicle stimulating hormone is the one that kind of helps develop the secondary characteristics, so the characteristics of puberty. In the ovaries, there is estrogens, which are estradiol, estron, and estriol. Those are 3 of the estrogens that are in the ovaries. These are what control the puberty characteristics also, mainly breast development and adipose tissue deposition, which is like fatty tissue, so it just deposits into the right spots. And then some of the estrogens also help with widening the hips. So in the female skeletal system, the pelvis is slightly larger, or it's more wide, and that is for childbirth. And then the other hormone that's in the ovaries is the progesterones, and that's basically just what happens when there are changes in the uterus. It helps, you know, with all that stuff. So my next information is from Medline Plus, and it's basically just about puberty. So puberty in females, it begins at about age 10 and can go as late as, or it can start as late as 14. The first sign is breast development, and then pubic hair and underarm hair, and then menstruation usually comes last. Menstruation, or a period as most people call it, happens once a month for 3 to 7 days at a time. And so what happens is the body is preparing to have a baby, to potentially have a baby. And so it thickens the walls of the uterus with a lining of blood. And then when your body realizes, oh, there's not a baby in here, it sheds that lining, and that is what the blood is, and 1 egg also comes with it. And that's how you lose eggs in your lifetime, because you bleed them out. During puberty, the hormones that I mentioned before they start being secreted. So before puberty, those hormones aren't really acting, but then puberty starts and those hormones come into play. Other things that happen during puberty that aren't necessarily related to like growth, but it's more of just like excessive oil production, which can cause acne and oily hair and just oily skin overall. And your sweat picks up an odor. So before puberty, your sweat, when you would sweat, it didn't really smell bad, but then puberty starts, the hormones pump, and then you start to stink. And that's why usually when they do the little puberty talk in elementary school, they give you a bag and it has like pads and tampons in it, and then there's usually a deodorant in there. That's because you're gonna stink. And then growth spurts can also occur, which is basically just when the body just begins growing like out of nowhere. And my teacher was telling us that her son grew 2 inches within 3 months, and that would be counted as a growth spurt because that was like a huge difference in such a short amount of time. And that usually happens that also happens when you're a baby, like all the way up until puberty. And then puberty, sort of, the growth spurts change. Instead of being growth in height and weight and things like that, it becomes more of like, in males, it's like your voice deepening, or girls, your hips widen, and you know, the adipose tissue deposits into the places that it needs to be, and things like that. For fetal development, I have 3 websites that I got my information from. The first one is Iowa State University Prenatal Development. The egg, once it's fertilized, when the sperm touches it and it's fertilized, it becomes a zygote. That's what it's called. And there are 3 stages of like birth, like fetal development. And these are usually called the trimesters, but their actual terms are germinal, embryonic, and fetal period. And the germinal period usually lasts 1 to 2 weeks. The embryonic is 3 to 8 weeks, and then fetal is 9 to 32 to 40, which is usually normal. Of course, there are things outside of that. Babies come whenever they want to, so there's the preemie babies and there's babies that are late, so anything can really happen, but the average is 32 to 40 weeks, and full term is 40 weeks. My next information is from Mayo Clinic, and Mayo Clinic says that the sperm and the egg unite in the fallopian tubes and form one singular cell, which is the zygote. There should be 46 chromosomes, and there should be 23 from the biological mom, 23 from the biological father. And soon after fertilization, the zygote will travel down to the uterus, and it divides into a cluster of cells, so it's not just one anymore, it's multiple, and implants itself on the wall of the uterus, and that's kind of like its little bed, its resting place for the baby to start to grow, and then it develops and becomes bigger, and that's why, you know. My last information is from Cleveland Clinic. Month 9 and 10 is usually when people go into labor. That's the most common. Of course, like I said earlier, there are people who have gone into labor at 5 months or, you know, things like that. So usually between 9 and 10 months, you would go into labor, and the baby's head must be facing down. Why this is because the baby's head, their skull isn't fully like closed. There's a little soft spot, if you've ever heard of that. And that soft spot, the skull bones that are there can kind of push together. And so it's easier to push the baby out where the baby can just slide out, sort of. It, you know, it wouldn't slide out, but it's easier than coming out through the feet, because, or with the feet first, because that would be really painful. And baby's like, get stuck, you know, things could happen. This is the part that really grosses me out, is that the vagina stretches to 10 centimeters for delivery. I just find that so weird and gross. I know it's not gross, but it's weird. And then it just goes right back after, I think it's 6 to 8 weeks, I want to say. It should start to, like, you know, it's like kind of like a rubber band. That's gross. Okay, so for my conclusion, just to wrap this up, honestly, I cannot wrap my brain around how this works. I understand, like, the steps and the process and, you know, the science behind it, but this is just so crazy to me. Like, I just can't understand it. It's so complex, but it's so simple. Without this system, I wouldn't be here telling you about this system, and you wouldn't be sitting here listening to me tell you about this system. We wouldn't exist. The human race wouldn't exist, honestly, because without this system, we wouldn't have been able to repopulate after people die, so we just wouldn't exist. And that's why I really feel like this is the most important system in any body system between male and female.